When thousands of messages disappear following the death of a young actor, what is erased is not merely information, it is the collective right to remember. The morning that absence began to expand like a shadow, the public still did not comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. Every post attempting to cling to the memory of Yu Menglong vanished in a matter of seconds, as if an invisible hand were sweeping through the networks to prevent mourning from finding a natural channel. In an environment where farewells should arise spontaneously, a sense of strangeness settled in that surpassed the simplicity of a technical error. The digital surface, usually saturated with immediate emotions, acquired an artificial sheen, too polished, too silent, as if life had been suspended in a stillness that no user had requested. The bewilderment grew with every deleted message. People tried to understand why even the most sober, respectful words disappeared before generating dialogue. There was no trace, no warnings, no explanations. Only the disturbing certainty that something was being withdrawn before it could settle in the heart of the public. Questions began to multiply in that imposed void. Why did a farewell need to be surveilled? What motive could justify the suppression of a gesture as elemental as sharing pain? How was it possible that such an intimate event had been absorbed by a mechanism acting with almost mechanical precision, without distinguishing between public figures and anonymous voices? But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damage, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. As the deletion spread across all platforms, it became clear that the story was not reduced to a technical phenomenon nor to the logical commotion following an artist's death. What emerged was a deep tension between the human need to express emotions and the logic of a system designed to administer every nuance of public life. Where there should have been a space for comfort, an invisible barrier arose, filtering not only data, but also the very possibility of feeling. That contrast between the public's natural impulse and the rigidity of the structure generated a disturbing paradox. While society tried to say goodbye to an actor whose trajectory had been marked by serenity and discipline, a silent mechanism seemed determined to prevent memory from taking shape. The absence of a visible record did not reduce the pain, but intensified it, for it transformed the farewell into an uncertain, fragile, almost clandestine act. In that ambiguous terrain, emotion remained suspended, trapped between the desire to remember and the impossibility of doing so openly. The depth of that silence announced that what happened could not be analyzed from the surface. The death of Yu Menglong had opened a crack, revealing something more than the loss of a young actor. It had exposed the latent tensions of an industry that, in attempting to preserve its impeccable image, ended up modeling not only public perception but also the way people understood the value of memory. It was the beginning of a journey into the hidden layers of a system that seemed to fear even the most discreet emotional trace. From the instant tension began to spread across the impeccably controlled surface of the industry, it became necessary to return to the origin, to where Yu Menglong's story had begun to take shape long before his name appeared in the credits of a national production. His journey did not arise from a sudden impulse or overflowing ambition, but from the serenity of a young man born in Jiangsu and raised in Xinjiang, two territories whose combination molded a deeply disciplined and attentive temperament. That calm, which so many directors described as a stable light, would transform over the years into the axis of a painful paradox. The very serenity making him stand out on screen made him a perfect target for a system rewarding silent obedience over emotional authenticity. When he arrived for the first time at the studios where the most recognized figures of national entertainment were forged, his discreet presence immediately caught attention. He did not seek to impose himself through grandiloquent gestures, nor claimed attention with elaborate speeches. He concentrated on observing, on absorbing every indication, on understanding how the gears of an environment demanding absolute precision were articulated. Colleagues who shared those early years with him remember the thoroughness with which he studied every script, adjusting the cadence of his words and the depth of his silences, as if every scene were an opportunity to honor a craft whose history far preceded his own trajectory. That sense of respect was uncommon among newcomers, many of whom trusted more in speed than in patience. In him, however, patience was a form of identity. On the surface, his incorporation into the professional world developed according to the natural course of those who, coming from distant provinces, aspired to a sustained artistic life. But the industry that welcomed him was far from being a space guided solely by talent. Behind the glamorous surface, the public saw every night a rigorous structure operated regulating schedules, decisions, words, and, in a way, even emotions. That structure did not function as a simple administrative entity. Rather, it seemed like a mechanism capable of anticipating every movement, keeping under surveillance every gesture that could influence audience perception. Young performers were reminded from their first training session that visibility was a privilege renewed daily. Any deviation, even minimal, could alter the trajectory carefully designed by the agencies representing them. The contracts defining their responsibilities were extensive documents in which the fine print acquired a weight going beyond the professional. It was not solely about meeting schedules or attending shooting sessions. The clauses included precise provisions on behavior in public spaces, restrictions on personal life, affective limitations, and strict obligations related to the projection of a uniform image. Spontaneity, which in many cases constitutes the core of artistic creativity, remained confined to places not within reach of cameras or unexpected spectators. For a young man accustomed to expressing serenity without artifice, adapting to that framework meant a slow process of internal accommodation, a kind of emotional training not featured in any technical manual. Exhaustion began to manifest almost imperceptibly. It did not appear in the form of complaints or public interruptions, because he knew every word could be interpreted as a sign of fragility. It insinuated itself, instead, in the way he moved between scenes, in the manner his shoulders seemed to carry a weight not explained by physical effort. Stylists, accustomed to working with actors subjected to intense workdays, mentioned discrete marks on his face and neck, always covered with habitual precision before the cameras turned on. No one asked questions, because asking could also be considered an imprudence. In that environment, silence was a survival tool, a way to avoid repercussions that could affect not only the individual, but the entire team, depending on the smooth advance of the production. In interviews, when asked about the emotional burden of the work, he resorted to metaphors that, at the time, seemed like poetic reflections. One of them, "The light is heavy, acquired over the years, a meaning transcending the beauty of the expression." Those who knew him understood he was not speaking of stage lighting or the physical demand of filming. He spoke of a sustained pressure, of a constant presence accompanying him even outside the studios, a kind of shine he had to keep intact so as not to alter the narrative expected of him. That light, apparently protective, was also a burden, forcing him to distance himself from what brought him balance. His visits to family became scarce, not out of disinterest, but out of the need to prevent those around him from being exposed to scrutiny they had not chosen. The accumulation of those pressures molded an emotional landscape where silence became the safest path. Every time he felt tiredness, he opted to reduce his public presence. Every time the demand increased, he reinforced the discipline characterizing him since childhood. That constant effort was not visible to the public, who saw only the serenity with which he interpreted his roles. But inside him, that serenity had transformed into armor-hiding tensions that could hardly find an outlet. The industry valued that type of self-control. It considered it proof of professionalism. But in reality, it was the indication of a deep, silent wear and tear sustained for too long. Understanding this stage is essential to understand the echo his death generated. The tragedy was not explained solely by the loss of a young actor. It was the final manifestation of a prolonged accumulation of demands that had limited every aspect of his life. His story revealed the fragility of a system that, in its attempt to preserve stability and efficiency, ended up demanding from its artists a form of emotional sacrifice remaining hidden behind the perfection of the spectacle. There, in that tension between appearance and reality, a crack began to be drawn that would later become one of the keys to understanding the impact his departure would have on collective memory. What do you think of this? Comment Amen below, so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The morning the news of Menglong's passing spread with the speed typical of unexpected tragedies, digital platforms began to transform into a stage no one had foreseen. What should have been a space where emotion could extend naturally became a place where every gesture of farewell was withdrawn before finding an interlocutor. At first, many users thought it was a momentary glitch, perhaps a habitual maladjustment caused by an extraordinary increase in traffic. However, the pattern began to repeat with such disturbing precision that it soon became clear the situation surpassed any technical explanation. Messages disappeared without distinction, as if a silent force were deployed to prevent mourning from being expressed in public. As the day advanced, even the accounts of established celebrities observed how their posts were withdrawn seconds after being shared. Renowned actresses who attempted to express their condolences met the same void as the anonymous public. The impossibility of keeping even a neutral message visible laid bare that the operation did not respond to the natural movement of a saturated platform, but to a protocol acting uniformly, regardless of the author or the content. What remained was a strangely clean digital landscape, a silence that did not bring serenity, but bewilderment. The constant elimination of messages provoked a sense of emotional disorientation that grew with every failed attempt to honor the actor's memory. Social networks, usually overflowing with spontaneous reactions, appeared as a sterilized space, where the absence of content was more eloquent than any public declaration. Some users described the experience as a sort of simultaneous memory wipe, an operation removing not only words but also the possibility for collective emotion to find a legitimate channel. The lack of official explanations fed the confusion and gave rise to theories attempting to fill the void that the absence of information had left open. In that climate of uncertainty, an unexpected event agitated the atmosphere even more. Presenter Liu Wei briefly published a screenshot of a conversation with makeup artist Song Se, a close friend of the actor. The most disturbing phrase, "the world destroyed him," expanded rapidly before the post disappeared along with the entire account. The sudden disappearance of that trace fed the perception that this was not simply an attempt to avoid rumors, but a systematic effort to prevent any emotional interpretation of the event. That phrase, brief and forceful, signaled that behind the tragedy existed a burden of suffering that perhaps had never been openly expressed. Public reaction divided immediately. A part of the audience interpreted the content removal as a measure destined to avoid harmful speculation, with the intention of protecting the family's privacy and preventing the tragedy from being distorted by unverified versions. They considered it natural that, in such a delicate moment, an attempt was made to maintain certain control over information. However, another part of the public perceived the operation as a deliberate effort to control the narrative, an attempt to prevent the actor's death from triggering a broader debate on the industry's structural conditions. For this group, the imposed silence did not seek to protect, but to hide. The tension between both interpretations began to grow, creating an emotional fracture reflected in every corner of the platforms. The international repercussion added an unexpected nuance. Users from different countries began to collect and translate screenshots that had been eliminated in the original environment. What had disappeared in one space reappeared in another, multiplied by the interest generated by the very act of censoring. Platforms like Reddit, TikTok, and X became improvised archives where fragments of information found refuge. Every recovered piece carried with it a sense of urgency. If something had to be withdrawn with such insistence, then it must possess a value the community was determined to preserve. The dynamic acquired the form of an inverted mirror, where elimination did not erase but amplified memory. Meanwhile, within the industry, the impact was felt with increasing intensity. Programs planned in advance began to postpone recordings. Previously agreed interviews were canceled without detailed explanations. Those artists who were supposed to appear at public events opted to withdraw temporarily, fearing that any statement, even the most innocent, could be interpreted as a deviation from the official framework. Communication agencies disseminated statements, sharing a common tone of caution and discretion, a language designed not to open any door that could put the imposed narrative stability at risk. The uniformity of those messages reflected that a deeper directive existed, a tacit agreement to sustain a silence that seemed to function as a protective barrier against emotional chaos. Foreign media approached the phenomenon from a more analytical perspective. Some specialists in cultural politics interpreted the massive deletion as a sign of the tensions existing between the idealized image the country wished to project and the real complexity of its media structure. From that reading, the operation sought not only to manage a delicate event, but also to prevent the tragedy from transforming into a questioning of mental health, work pressure, and the limited autonomy of those forming part of the entertainment industry. The idea that a system could fear even collective mourning began to install itself as an indication of institutional fragility rather than a show of strength. For Yu Menglong's admirers, the experience became emotionally contradictory. On one hand, they wished to respect the family's privacy. On the other, they felt the need to preserve the actor's memory in an environment that seemed determined to erase any trace of his presence. Many began to resort to forms of symbolic expression, avoiding algorithmic scrutiny, images suggesting without naming, abstract phrases that only those following the case could interpret, shared silences functioning as an act of community. Those discrete signals, scattered in different digital corners, became small islands of memory, revealing the persistence of an emotional bond that could not be eliminated with the same ease as a message. Throughout this process, the imposed silence did not reduce public interest. On the contrary, it intensified it until turning the case into a phenomenon transcending borders. Every eliminated message, fed the impulse to seek answers, to reconstruct what was being withdrawn. The tragedy ceased to be an isolated fact to transform into a reflection of the tensions emerging when a system attempts to administer not only information, but also collective emotion. In that constant search, the audience began to understand that what was at stake was not solely the memory of an actor, but the right to experience and express humanity in an environment where even sadness seemed to need authorization. The silence extending after the massive disappearance of messages did not produce the calm some expected. On the contrary, it generated an emotional density settling over those who had closely followed Menglong's trajectory. In the studios where he had worked, conversations diluted little by little, replaced by cautious glances suggesting not only sadness, but also a latent fear of the repercussions of uttering a word outside the established framework. The absence of verifiable information fed the impression that mourning had been displaced to an uncertain territory, a space where every question had to be formulated with extreme prudence. As the days advanced, the family opted to shelter in a respectful silence that intensified the sensation of collective emptiness. What was being lived was not simply a personal tragedy, but a moment in which memory seemed suspended between invisible forces defining what could be expressed and what had to disappear without a trace. This opacity molded an emotional tension expanding beyond digital platforms. Many admirers described a sense of powerlessness, intensifying with every failed attempt to access a coherent version of the facts. The deliberate absence of data transformed every rumor into a threat, every reflection into a risk. In that climate, any gesture could be interpreted as a sign of transgression, and no participant in the public sphere seemed willing to assume responsibility for a comment that could unleash unexpected consequences. The tragedy, instead of advancing toward clarity, seemed to slide toward a terrain where the unspoken weighed more than any explicit declaration. Collective memory sought a point of support, but found only the cold surface of a system privileging narrative stability over emotional relief. When the environment reached that level of extreme containment, an event occurred, minimal in appearance but decisive in its effect. A brief video, recorded casually during a break in one of the actors' shoots, began to circulate on an international platform. It was a simple scene, Menglong sitting next to a technical crew, conversing with someone off camera. The serenity of his smile, discreet and warm, produced a deep contrast with the oppressive climate dominating the public narrative. That image showed neither extravagance nor dramatic intensity. On the contrary, it revealed a quotidian humanity that no elimination mechanism seemed capable of dissolving. In that minimal gesture, a light was condensed that remained intact, a presence escaping the rigidity of any control structure. Users who found the video reacted with a mixture of tenderness and revelation. The authenticity of that instant returned to many the sensation that a fragment of truth still existed that could not be erased. In a matter of hours, the clip crossed digital and cultural borders, reaching communities unaware of the actor's history in detail, but who recognized the naturalness of his expression. The emotion it awakened did not arise from an elaborate speech, but from the silent evidence that humanity persists even when circumstances try to suppress it. From that moment, collective perception experienced an unexpected turn. The tragedy ceased to be an event trapped in a framework of restrictions and began to transform into a broader reflection on the right to preserve that which gives meaning to existence. The diffusion of the clip provoked a spontaneous movement within the industry. Some artists began to share symbolic works, illustrations, and compositions alluding to the persistence of light, to the difficulty of silencing an authentic emotion. Although these expressions eluded any direct reference to the case, those knowing the background interpreted them as signs of silent support, as ways to accompany the mourning without openly challenging the norms regulating public activity. This metaphorical language offered a bridge between respect for the institutional framework and the collective need to remember. With every gesture, however minimal, it was affirmed that dimensions of human experience existed that could not be reduced to an administrative protocol. That movement gave rise to a phenomenon some analysts termed expanded memory. The concept described the way the actor's memory extended through fragments escaping official frameworks. Photographs saved by followers, translated comments, re-uploaded videos, details recovered from the personal archives of those who had worked with him. Memory, far from being confined by the initial restrictions, acquired an unexpected autonomy, multiplying in spaces the system could not reach to control. This process did not arise as a frontal challenge nor as a gesture of confrontation. It was, rather, the silent expression of a deeply human impulse, the desire to preserve the dignity of a life that had touched thousands of people. The emotional impact of the clip was so profound that many users began to speak of a silent presence. The expression described a peculiar phenomenon, the sensation that the actor's memory continued influencing conversations, even when his name was not explicitly mentioned. In that context, silence did not represent absence, but a space in which the public reconstructed the story from their own experience. Memory became an act of cultural resistance, a collective gesture questioning the idea that a narrative could be completely molded from a hierarchical structure. What had begun as a spontaneous gesture transformed into a collective affirmation regarding the importance of remembering even when open expression was restricted. The expansion of the case introduced a deeper reflection on the limits of information control. Several specialists pointed out that the suppression of content can temporarily contain the diffusion of certain elements, but cannot prevent the absence itself from transforming into a significant clue. The more the narrative was attempted to be led toward a point of absolute stillness, the greater the public's impulse to recover the scattered fragments and reconstruct them into a form allowing meaning to be granted to the experience. Social memory, instead of extinguishing, acquired an autonomous force, revealing the fragility of any system pretending to manage it with absolute precision. In that interaction between control and persistence, the decisive turning point was born, the collective understanding that emotional truth always finds a way, even when data disappears from the surface. From that moment, the tragedy began to acquire a broader meaning. The story no longer belonged solely to the realm of show business, but transformed into a debate on the need to preserve spaces where emotions can be expressed without fear, where memory does not depend on external authorization. Menglong's case thus became a symbol of the permanent tension between human vulnerability and the structures attempting to regulate it. At that crossroads, the public discovered that remembering is not a passive gesture, but an act of cultural and emotional resistance. The story that began with the silent disappearance of thousands of messages ended up revealing a dimension much deeper than merely the death of a young actor. As the echo of events expanded beyond digital borders, it became evident that what happened with Menglong had opened a crack in the carefully administered surface of the entertainment industry. There, in that space where human emotion and institutional control converge, the tragedy acquired a meaning transcending his individual biography. The sudden absence of data, the prolonged silence, and the persistence of expanded memory revealed the complex relationship between the structures attempting to regulate public sensitivity and the communities refusing to renounce their capacity to remember. The actor's memory did not remain confined to the limits attempted to be imposed in the early days. On the contrary, it came to life in discrete gestures, in recovered videos, in words shared with caution, and in the collective determination of those refusing to allow a meaningful existence to remain without a trace. In that process, the public rediscovered that remembering is not a passive action, but a conscious exercise, a mode of affirming that human dignity does not depend solely on the permanence of material, but on the depth of the emotional bond uniting a community with those who have marked their experience, even from the distance of a screen. Analysts, following the evolution of the case, closely coincided that the tragedy offered a fundamental lesson on the limits of information control. Although a system can order the withdrawal of content and regulate its immediate circulation, it cannot administer the emotional interpretation that silence provokes. The deliberate absence of data becomes a clue, driving the public to reconstruct the scattered fragments. And in that act, a form of truth is born that can hardly be contained. The more a story is restricted, the greater the determination of those observing it to give it continuity, and that movement reveals the fragility of any structure pretending to completely mold social perception. From this perspective, the figure of Menglong began to transform into an unexpected symbol, the persistence of light in an environment where darkness seemed to impose itself as the norm. It also represented the certainty that emotional truth can find a way even when data disappears. For many, his story crystallized a broader debate on the importance of protecting spaces where human emotions can be expressed without fear, where memory does not depend on external authorizations, or institutional frameworks defining what can remain visible. The learning emerging from this experience is significant. Memory is a territory belonging to those feeling the need to grant meaning to their experience, not to the structures attempting to administer it. Menglong's tragedy reminds us that human vulnerability cannot be erased with the same ease as a message, because its value resides in the collective capacity to honor it, preserve it, and reinterpret it. The lesson is not limited to the realm of show business, but traverses every space where public emotion meets the limits of control. In a world where visibility can be regulated, sensitivity remains as a natural impulse, resisting even the most rigid structures. The future poses questions that do not yet have a definitive answer. How will the relationship between the public and the systems administering information evolve? What forms will emotional expression adopt in an environment where memory is so vulnerable and at the same time so resistant? Perhaps new forms of dialogue will emerge, granting greater transparency to those participating in highly regulated industries. Or perhaps the experience will leave a mark, driving digital communities to protect, with more determination, the spaces where emotions can find a legitimate channel. If you wish to delve deeper into some aspect of this story or explore other cases where memory and silence intertwine in a similar way, I will be here to continue the conversation and accompany you in the direction you choose to follow.